I'm in Chutz La'aretz. So this week's Sedra is Parshas Shelach. And in Parshas Shelach, so is the episode of the meraglim, the spies that were sent out by Moshe Rabbeinu to search out the land of Canaan. Beginning of the Sedra, the Torah says, "Ve'iraber Hashem Moshe lemor shlach lecha anoshim v'yasuru es eretz Canaan asher ni nosein livnei Yisrael." So God spoke to Moshe, saying, "Send for you men of distinction, v'yasuru, and let them spy out the land of Canaan that I am giving to the Jewish people." And the simple reading of the pasuk would indicate that the simple reading of the pasuk would indicate that it was a mitzvah, it was a tzivui, it was a command that God said to Moshe, send out the meraglim, send out the spies to search out the land of Israel. However, in Chumash Dvarim, the Torah tells us an altogether different story. When Moshe Rabbeinu looks back and he's recalling what happened throughout the years of their going through the desert and all the travail and the problems that happened in the desert, he says, you, the Jewish people, you came to me and you said, let us send out people to search out the land of Canaan. Vayita beinei hadavar. And it appeared to be a good idea in my eyes. It seems that from their pasuk over there, it wasn't a command from God. It was something that was suggested by the Jewish people, and Moshe Rabbeinu approved of the idea. And this question, our Chachamim, Chazal, our sages, they raise this contradiction, the seeming contradiction. And they say that really what happened was, first the Jewish people came to Moshe Rabbeinu. And they said to Moshe Rabbeinu that it suggested that he send out spies. Moshe Rabbeinu liked the idea, so then he asked God for permission to send out spies. And God said, according to our sages, he said, I guess figuratively, God said, if you want, send out spies, but you're going to be opening a Pandora's box. You're going to cause problems, which is what happened. In other words, the spies then led a rebellion against Moshe and against God. But the question is, the simple reading of the pasuk gives a different impression. Shlach lecha, yes, shlach lecha. Send out if you choose to do so. But that's not the simple reading of the pasuk. If someone didn't know what our sages said, they would not understand the pasuk that way. And certainly when they come to Parshas Shelach, before they get to Chumash Dvarim, it wouldn't even dawn on them such a possibility. So why is it that the Torah, in presenting the permission given by God to the Jewish people to search out the land of Canaan and sending spies, puts it in a manner that gives the impression that it was almost a requirement, it was a mitzvah? And I think the simple answer is because the Torah, when we read the Torah, and in a sense, the Torah wants us to experience, when we read the Torah, to a certain degree, the events that took place. You know, sometimes when you know what happened at the end, you miss the feelings and emotions that people had when the events were unfolding. Sometimes when the events are unfolding, we have one attitude. But when we look back, we have an altogether different impression as to what happened. And the Torah wants us not only to see what was the attitude of the Jewish people when they look back, but we have to understand, in order to understand the mistakes that the Jewish people made, we have to understand what were their emotions and feelings at the time they made those mistakes. And there's a tendency among people when they get a heter for something, when they have a shaila, is something allowed or something is not allowed? And it's something that they really want to do. So they in their mind, it becomes not just something that's allowed, but they want to give the heter a certain religious fervor. And because they want the heter to have a certain religious fervor, in their minds, it becomes a mitzvah. I'll give you a number of examples. Many years ago, there was a shaila raised about some of the baseball gloves, whether it had shatnez in it or it didn't have shatnez in it, or many of them did have shatnez, but whether it was the type of shatnez that was prohibited in the Torah and not prohibited in the Torah. And because of that, many people refrained for a short while from playing baseball. As soon as the heter came on that day, it was a Friday, it was a short, nevertheless, in all the parks, you saw yeshiva boys having a baseball game. I have nothing against baseball games, but it became a mitzvah to have a baseball game that day. It was allowed, but they sort of went out of their way to do it. Another case, years ago, there was a certain gadol b'Torah. There's a question, there's a machlokes haposkim, whether one is allowed under normal circumstances to ride a bicycle on Yom Tov outside, if you're allowed to ride a bicycle on Yom Tov. My father told me that Rav Greineman was the brother-in-law of the Chazon Ish. He lived in the United States for a short while. He was involved in the Siftat Farish Yerushalayim, where my father had his first job. He was a Rabbi in the yeshiva there, and Rav Greineman, who was close with Reb Chaim Moser, told him that Reb Chaim Moser felt, for whatever reason, that it's usher to ride a bike on Yom Tov. He felt it was an uvdin d'chol. But many poskim felt that it's mutter. We're not talking about special circumstances. So many poskim felt that it was mutter. There was one gadol b'Torah who lived for a while in Chicago, who also, a great Goan, he also felt it was mutter. And when he gave his psak that it was mutter, so all his talmidim took their bikes and they made a parade on the first Yom Tov, and they went from shul to shul with their bikes. Under normal circumstances, I'm not talking, but under normal circumstances, they rode their bike, they rode their bike. They didn't ride their bike, they didn't ride their bike. But since it was mutter, it became a mitzvah. Not only did they make a parade going from shul to shul with their bikes, but those that didn't have bikes went out to buy a bike before Yom Tov. Just like people go out before Sukkot to buy a lulav and esrog. Now, their Rebbe didn't tell them that it was a mitzvah to ride a bike. He just said it was mutter, it was allowed. But that's the way it is. That's the psychology of people. When something becomes mutter, in order to give the heter, I'm not saying anything whether it's mutter or usher now, that's a separate issue. The psychology of people is they want to give the heter, they want to give the heter religious fervor. I remember years ago, my father came to Chicago. My father was the first one, really, to observe Yashan. There is a machlokes, there's a dispute whether Yashan is required outside the land of Israel, and there are other heterim also. But there were those people who didn't observe Yashan that felt that they wouldn't eat something that was Yashan. It had to be Chadash. They wanted to give it. It's like they would say, pass the Chadash plate. That's the way it was. And unfortunately, to a large degree, perhaps in other areas, because today in the yeshiva world, Yashin became very accepted, especially many of these people, their sons went to Eretz Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael, in the religion, in the yeshivas, Yashan is observed. So today they have a different attitude. But so long as it was something that was mutter, and to a certain degree it might be because they had to out from the people that observed Yashan. So the only way to out from them was to declare that it's a mitzvah not to eat it. So it's very, the Torah wants us to put us in this situation. The Torah wants us to understand the Jewish people so badly wanted to send spies that when God allowed them to send spies, so to them it became a mitzvah to send spies. So the Torah says, mentions it in the form with words that give the impression that it was a mitzvah, but it says the word lecha. In other words, to resolve the contradiction, to realize what the truth is. So as it was developing, as the situation was developing, it appeared to the Jewish people that it was a mitzvah to send spies. However, when they look back, in retrospect, hindsight is 20/20 vision, they realized it was a big mistake. And I think the question is, but it appears, and Torah says very clearly in Chumash Dvarim, that Moshe Rabbeinu thought it was a good idea to send spies. So we have to understand, why did Moshe Rabbeinu feel that it was a good idea to send spies? And to answer that question, I want to mention a different question that was raised by my father. And then I would like to mention my father's explanation to it. I want to add something to it. And then if we have time, I'll give my own explanation. My father was somewhat troubled about the meraglim. The meraglim went out, and when they returned, and when they went out, they were actually Anoshim Tzadikim, Rashi tells us. But in the period of 40 days, these Anoshim Tzadikim, these leaders of the Jewish people, came back and led a revolt not only against Moshe, but against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But there were 12 spies sent out, one from each Shevet, one from each tribe. 10 came back and gave a report that although the land itself is a very beautiful land and it has great fruit, and they brought samples of the fruit, nevertheless, they said that the Jewish people did not have the ability to overcome the Canaanite. And 2, Yehoshua and Kalev, on the contrary, they said, Olonale, Virashno, so let's go, we can do it. If God wants. So the question is, why is it that the 10 spies gave a detrimental report and the 2 spies gave a positive report? After all, they went together. The Medrash says that Kalev went to the Maras Machpelah, and it seems that the others might not have gone to the Maras Machpelah. From the Baal Turim, this seems to be 2 ways to read it. But from the Medrash, it appears that Kalev was the only one who went to the Maras Machpelah. But aside from the Maras Machpelah, everybody all 12 viewed the land together. And the question is, why did 10 give a bad report, a negative report, and 2 gave a positive report? Yes, we can do it. Let us go to the land of Israel. Now, so my father would always say that you have 2 types of mitzvos. You have mitzvos that are based on logic of the heart, and you have mitzvos that are based on logic of the mind. And he applied that very often. A mitzvah that's based on logic of the mind, not stealing, very easily understand. It's very easy to understand. It doesn't require a special emotional feeling, just a logical understanding. One understands that they don't steal. But there are mitzvahs, on the other hand, that are grounded in emotion. You have mitzvahs, let's say, mitzvah of Avas Yisrael, a mitzvah of Avas HaKadosh Baruch Hu, love of God, that are grounded in feeling and emotion rather than an intellectual evaluation. And my father said that Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah that is grounded not in logic, but the Torah demands emotion and feeling in regard to Eretz Yisrael. The Eretz Yisrael, in benching we say Eretz Chemda. What does Chemda mean? Eretz Yisrael is a land that we covet, desire. When someone covets something, he is almost forced to act because the desire of coveting pushes him very often to ignore rational evaluation. And to a large degree, when we deal with Eretz Yisrael, we cannot base it on rational evaluation. We just recently in Shavuos, we read Megillas Rus. Elimelech leaves Eretz Yisrael because there was starvation. There are situations of starvation when one is allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. But Elimelech, he left Eretz Yisrael. He did not have that emotional attachment. From an intellectual evaluation, it wasn't worth being in Eretz Yisrael. The economic conditions were better in Eretz Moab. So because of that, he left Eretz Yisrael. Elimelech was a leader of the Jewish people. But in regard to Eretz Yisrael, and perhaps in regard to other mitzvahs as well, his attitude was one of logic of the mind rather than logic of the heart. Matter of fact, in last week's Sedra, the Torah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu said to God, Did I give birth to these people that I should be able to feed all of them? And there's a very interesting Sfas Emes. The Sfas Emes said that had Moshe given birth to them, so all the logic would have been pushed aside. Because when a parent has to feed a child, so it's not based on rational thinking. He's able, he does it no matter what. This Sfas Emes was giving Musar to one of his Hasidim. So he told him that he had to act. He had to act in a manner that was grounded in emotions rather than intellectual evaluation. And the truth is that the Jewish people were militarily, at that time anyway, weaker than the Canaanim. But sometimes when someone is motivated by the logic of the heart, then the intellectual evaluation is pushed aside. There are cases known where a child, chas v'shalom, I've read a few cases, was underneath a car, and the parents just, it can't even be explained scientifically, just somehow were able to push the car in such a way to get it off the child. This is the idea of logic of the heart. So the Jewish people were weaker than the Canaanim. But when you have the logic of the heart, that sometimes gives us the ability to overcome the intellectual military evaluation that the opponent has. And this is the difference. Yehoshua and Kalev, they saw what the other spies saw. But they saw Eretz Yisrael not from the basis of the logic of the mind, but they saw Eretz Yisrael on the basis of the logic of the heart. And that's why, in spite of the strength that the Canaanim had, they gave, this is what my father said, a positive report. Whereas the 10 spies, they made intellectual evaluation. And on the basis of the intellectual evaluation, the Canaanim would have defeated the Jewish people. And listen, in 1948, it's well known, the Jews were outnumbered in great amounts, and the Arabs were better equipped. And nevertheless, the Jews were able to overcome all the Arab armies that surrounded Israel. Why were they able to overcome the Arab armies? Because those Jews, many of them survivors of the concentration camps, they fought not with the logic of the mind. It was the logic of the heart. And because they fought with the logic of the heart, they were able to overcome the superior forces of the Arab nations. And this is the answer that my father gave. I want to take that just a little bit further. When one looks at the Aseret Dibros, so when it's different the way the Aseret Dibros are read and the way it's written. Now in Parshas Yisro, so the Torah says, Lo sachmo beis re'echa, and la sachmo de'eshes re'echa, v'avodo, v'amoso, v'shoro, v'chamoro, v'chol asher re'echa. Do not covet the house of your friend, and do not covet the wife of your friend, his servant, maidservant, ox, etc., and his possessions. And the way it's written, between the different commandments, there are spaces in the Torah. So the two lo sachmots are written as two separate commandments. However, when we read it, we read the two lo sachmots as one commandment. There's only one sof pasuk. And the question is, if it was said as one commandment, and the assumption is it was said as one commandment, so why is it written in the Torah as two separate commandments with a space separating the two lo sachmots? What's the difference between the reading of lo sachmot and the saying of lo sachmot, and of the prohibition of not coveting? And I think the Torah tells us that the Jewish people, according to our sages, says v'chol ha'am roem es hakolos b'salapidim v'eskol ha'shofar v'eshahar ashem. The people not only heard the sound of God's voice, but they actually saw the sounds. So the Jewish people at Mount Sinai heard the words of God and the sounds that were made at Har Sinai, and they saw the sounds also, something that's difficult for us to understand. And so what I think is that when they heard it as one commandment. But when they saw the sounds, and perhaps on the luchos, it was that way. Of course, you would have to change the luchos in front of every shul. When they saw, and perhaps on the luchos it was that way, it was two separate commandments, the two lo sachmots. And I think why it was, in a sense, to emphasize to the act of seeing the prohibition the prohibition of coveting or desire. Because coveting and desire usually begins with seeing. So in order to impress the eye about the prohibition of coveting and desire, the Torah, when the Jews saw the commandments, gave special emphasis to these two commandments to emphasize for the eye the prohibition. Emphasizing for the eye means the eye does not let me see certain things in a manner that will cause me to want to covet. And I think that's when coveting is negative. But in regard to Eretz Yisrael is an Eretz Chemda. It's a positive thing, coveting. So Moshe Rabbeinu felt that since coveting is caused to a large degree by seeing, so he wanted to send out the spies that they should actually see the land of Israel. So when they go into the land of Israel, they'll be going in with a feeling of a land that is coveted. And so that's why Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to send the spies. However, Moshe Rabbeinu's mistake was that, I shouldn't say Moshe Rabbeinu's mistake, but the problem was that when they were given the task of evaluating the land of Israel, there were other criteria. The main criteria perhaps being, as the Netziv and some point out, that their position as Nesiim, when they get to Eretz Yisrael, would be undermined. In the desert, in a certain manner, the 12 tribes were like 12 nations with an alliance. But once they enter Eretz Yisrael, they would become like one nation. So other criteria played a role in the way they saw Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael by itself is an Eretz Chemda. But if somebody goes with an attitude, a negative attitude, then it's not an Eretz Chemda, but they see it in a very bad light. And I think in a certain sense, we could understand this with a medrash that I once saw. There was a book, I don't have that sefer anymore. It was called Medrash Kliya. They took medrashim that seemed very, very strange. They collected medrashim. And there is a pasuk here in this week's Sadra that says, V'hayamim, when the spies went to Eretz Yisrael, V'hayamim yemei bikurei anavim. The days were the days of the ripening of the grapes. And this medrash brought in the Sefer Medrash Kliya says that if it hadn't been the days of the ripening of the grapes, so the whole tragedy that took place with the meraglim would not have happened. We have to understand, what does that mean? Just because it was the period of the ripening of the grapes, so because of that, because of that, the Jewish people, we underwent this tragedy because of because of the report that was given by the 10 meraglim, the 10 spies. But I think with the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, beginning of Moreh Nevuchim, I think it's Parak Beis, in the first Chelek, we could understand this medrash. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim mentions that a certain philosopher asked him a question that he says he thinks that every thinking person should ask. And the Rambam there says, the question the philosopher asked, he says, Adam and Eve ate from the Eitz Hadas, from the tree of knowledge. And they committed a grave sin. Says if one reads the psukim, one gets the impression that to a certain degree, they were rewarded for their sin because they became Yodea Tov V'Ra. They became knowledgeable in good and bad. And the Rambam, and he asked the Rambam, if they sinned, why were they rewarded in becoming Yodea Tov V'Ra, in knowing good and bad, good and evil? And the Rambam said that before the sin, man was Yodea Emes V'Sheker. He knew good, he knew true and false. After the sin, he knew good and bad. What does that mean? Before the sin, now, when we deal with science and mathematics, there's a law of gravity. My father would always give that example. There's a law of gravity. The law of gravity is not bad, it's not good. It could be bad, it could be good, depending on the circumstances. But as a law, it's a law. To say there is a law of gravity is true. To say that there is no gravity, that would be false. It's not a question of good and bad. And then, my father would say, a triangle has 180 degrees. Says it's not good that a triangle has 180 degrees. And if somebody says a triangle has 130 degrees, it's not bad, it's false. So when it comes to scientific matters, when it comes to mathematical matters, it's not a question of good and bad. It's a question of true and false. However, good and bad is when it comes to questions of morality. So he says before, in a certain sense, the Ram is saying, before the sin, man was both. Man was a mathematician and a scientist. He saw everything from the perspective of true and false. After the sin, then he became a moralist. Everything was viewed from the perspective of good and bad. So all the Mefarshim find a lot of trouble with the Rambam. In other words, being a moralist is on a lower level than being a mathematician and a scientist. We couldn't suggest that the Rambam would agree to that. I think one of the Mefarshim says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give mechila to the Rambam in his generation. The question is, what did the Rambam mean? I heard from my father, and I also saw that my uncle said the same shot. And I heard others said the same shot, that before man sinned. There was no separation between mathematics, science, and morality. Everything was viewed from the perspective of true and false. A person shouldn't kill, not only because killing is bad for mankind. Killing is bad for the world, which it certainly is. But a person shouldn't kill because a person shouldn't kill. And matter of fact, I would take it a step further. A person should see that he doesn't have the ability to kill. If we see it from the same perspective as we see scientific facts and mathematical facts. But once we view things from the perspective of good and bad, then I had the ability to do certain things. And if I have the ability to do certain things, so everybody probably has a list of people that they think it's not so bad if they wouldn't be here. And so this was the downfall of man. The downfall of man, according to the Rambam, was the separation of mathematical truths and scientific truths on one hand, which was based on emes v'sheker, and the moral truths or Torah, which in man's mind became based on tov v'ra and good and bad. And I think this is what that medrash means. There is a machlokus, big machlokus Tanaim, the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge. What type of fruit that it produced? If you look in the medrash, Gemara and Brachas also discusses it, but you look in the medrash, I think almost every type of fruit, there is an opinion for almost every type of fruit. The only fruit that I didn't see an opinion, there were some others also, was an apple. I know in all the books they have a picture of an apple as being the fruit, but that there is no such opinion. But the Gemara seems to conclude, it's very strange that even though it's not a fruit and not a tree, the Gemara discusses that it was a form of wheat. However, the Medrash seems to conclude that it was a grapevine. Most of the opinions in the Medrash say that it was a grapevine. And I think this is what the Medrash means. This was the mistake. God said it's a good land. It's a good land. If God said it's an Eretz Chemda, it's an Eretz Chemda. But the Bikurei Anavim in Medrash style means the ripening of the grapes, meaning the ripening of the Eitz Hadas. This was the perpetuation of the problem of the Eitz Hadas, when man began to see things from the perspective of good and bad rather than true and false. And good and bad, that gives me the ability, and sometimes it gives me the rationalization to do that which otherwise would be false. And this was the problem. This was the problem with meraglim. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he sent them out, he expected them to see the land from the perspective of the emes v'sheker, and to see they're observing the land. They're searching out the land. They're looking at the land to strengthen the chemda, the coveting for the land that God told them to have. But unfortunately, once they knew that they had to give a report, So that gave them the ability to realize there might be an alternative approach. So that's the reason that's the reason that the Jewish people came back. The meraglim came back and gave this report that because they viewed Eretz Yisrael from the perspective of true and of good and bad, and what might be good to one person is bad to another person. But what is true, and what is false. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu, however, expected more from the meraglim. Now, I think there is another possible approach to this Parshas Shelach, and that is, it's very interesting that Moshe Rabbeinu, that the first time when they first came back, and the meraglim gave their false reports. The 10 meraglim gave false reports, and the 2 meraglim gave a positive report. The 2 meraglim, Yoshua and Kalev, said, "Olo na'ala v'yarashnu asa, ki nochal yuchala." Let us go up and let us inherit the land, because we can take it. They don't even mention God's name. And it's very interesting, when God's name is not mentioned, the Maharal sometimes points this out in regard to the Megillah, that when God's name is not mentioned, of course, everything is done by God. But there are God's hand sometimes works within nature and sometimes outside of nature. Sometimes the events appear miraculous. So the Yoshua and Kalev were saying, we can do it. We can do it. We don't even need miracles. Why? How did they explain it? But I mentioned when on the shir that I gave for Yom Yerushalayim, that the Rosh says that a person is more determined to keep what is his than to take what belongs to somebody else. And sometimes that advantage of the feeling of ownership gives somebody who's weaker the ability to overcome the advantage of strength that the other party has. And Yoshua and Kalev, they felt they weren't coming to take the land of Israel away from the Canaanites. The land of Israel was given to Avraham Avinu. And since the land of Israel was given to Avraham Avinu, they're not coming to capture something that belonged to somebody else. They're coming to keep or take control of what belonged to them. And it's true that the Canaanites might have felt that they too were the owners of the land of Israel. But first of all, the feeling of ownership emanating from the fact that it was given by God, that is the strongest feeling of ownership possible. And then also, Torah tells us that prior to Avraham Avinu coming to Eretz Yisrael, the Canaanim came just about the same time, a little bit before Avraham Avinu. Torah says, "V'haknani oz baretz." The Canaanim came then in the land. They weren't there beforehand. And who was it? Who had the land of Israel beforehand? The sons of Shem. Jewish people are descendants of Shem. But the Canaanites came and took it away from the sons of Shem. So it was never their land. So Yoshua and Kalev, Kalev actually was the one who said it, felt that Eretz Yisrael is ours. Yes, the Canaanites might be stronger, but we have the advantage of the feeling of ownership that the Canaanites couldn't have that same feeling of ownership. And consequently, we could overcome we can overcome the Canaanites in spite of their strength. However, after a while, Yoshua and Kalev saw that the Jewish people did not have that same feeling of ownership. And when the Jewish people rebelled and they did not accept the argument of Kalev, so Yoshua and Kalev tore their clothes and they said, Im chafetz banu Hashem, if God wants, Behavio sanu la'aretz hazos sanu lanu, He could bring us to this land, Eretz asher hizavas chol dvash, a land of flowing milk and honey. So he was saying that the land was they said, even if you don't have that feeling of ownership that you should have, but through miracles HaKadosh Baruch Hu could give it to us if we don't rebel against Him, and that was also rejected. And why did the meraglim reject that? Why did they reject the idea that God will give it to the Jewish people miraculously? They saw so many miracles in the desert. They saw miracles at Yetzias Mitzrayim. Why did they reject it? The answer is they wanted to be able to have the opportunity to make believe that they were able to capture the land by themselves, that God played no role. And if the only way they could get Eretz Yisrael was through miracles, they didn't want Eretz Yisrael, because that would have emphasized to them their dependency upon God. And they did not want to face the fact that they should have no alternative but to realize their dependency upon God. So, and there's a mitzvah bikurim. The mitzvah bikurim, we bring fruit. The meraglim also brought fruit. And when they brought the fruit, they said, the fruit is very good, the land is very good, but we'll never be able to have this land. We bring the fruit when the bikurim are brought. So we say that it's God gave, this is the land that God promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the promise is part of the giving of the land to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And it's God that gave us this land. We acknowledge both. We acknowledge it as an inheritance from the Avos, and we acknowledge that everything we have is a present from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, was something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us. And I just want to add one point before I finish. Recently, there were some people into Bible criticism who came up with this foolish idea that up till the time of Shmuel Hanavi, everything that's in the Chumash never really happened. It's fairy tales. I don't understand some people. You have people who will demonstrate, will make demonstrations at times on behalf of the state of Israel. Demonstrations declaring that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. And at the same time, they at the same time, they give respectability to the opinion that Avram Avinu never existed, that Yitzchak never existed, Yaakov never existed. In a sense, what they're saying is that Eretz Yisrael was never ours. Okay, we might have invaded and took it, and we lost it. And now we invaded it again and took it. So, in a sense, they're saying we are occupiers. The land of Eretz Yisrael doesn't belong to us. And the same people that will demonstrate there's a certain hypocrisy involved, that will demonstrate, even sometimes going to jail on behalf of the state of Israel, give legitimacy to those who reject Tanakh. And in doing so, they reject the rights of the Jewish people, certainly from a moral perspective, to the land of Israel. And even Ben Gurion, I mentioned, when he was asked if he has any contract with the Jewish people, have any contract, any to show ownership of the land of Israel, he took out the Tanakh. Eretz Yisrael being ours is based on our recognition of Tanakh. Those who say that a good part of Tanakh is just fairy tales, they really have no right to say anything about the state of Israel, because they don't believe that the state of Israel is a Jewish land. All right, thank you.
Yeah, Shukach, thank you very much. One announcement is some people who are here from Israel asked maybe we could start share a little earlier. So in the chat right now, if people from Israel and not from Israel are okay with starting the share a little earlier, let's say, what, 10:30, were we saying?
Yeah.
So if people could just say they want to keep the share the same, or they're okay making it earlier, we'll decide during the week if we're going to keep the share at this time or make it a little earlier. And also, if you have questions, please type the questions in the chat also, and I will ask Rabbi Soloveichik. So again, so for the chat about the time, I don't have a poll up here, but if you want it at the same, just write same. If you want it earlier, just write earlier, and we'll take a poll that way.
It would say either okay or
same or earlier.
So okay.
Okay, and also if anyone has any questions, you could type that in the chat box also. Oops. So one question is, could you clarify what you said about the two Losach modes in the Aseret Dibros? So yes. Is it a Shemos Dibros?
Well, Shemos has two Losach modes, and in Dvarim, Vaschanan, it's Lo Sasava and Lo Sachmo, but it's the same thing. Desire also begins with the I.
I think the clarification is that if you look, there's a Parsha, there's a here, I don't know if people could see in the Chumash here, there's a Samach, the Samach for Parshas Stuma in between Lo Sachmot. So the way it's written, there's different
extra spaces.
There's two different Dibro. It's written as if there's a separation between Lo Sachmod and Lo Sachmod.
Yeah.
And I think why was it Kalev and not Yoshua who quieted the people by asserting Alo Nala?
Olo Nala. The reason it was Kalev and not Yoshua, because Kalev, Yoshua was a little bit to the side, because the spies thought that Kalev was with them. They knew that Yoshua wasn't with them. So they didn't even give Yoshua a platform to say anything. And Kalev walked in together with them. So was standing with them. So that's what the Medrash says. He says that, and in fact, the Medrash says when the spies finish saying what they want, so Kalev says, not only that, but and so he was sort of part of he was talking as part of the report of the other 10 spies, whereas Yoshua was to the side at that point.